you could argue that the show Peacemaker, which I really liked, right? You could argue that it's dealing with from a standpoint of like where does the lead character's trauma come from? It's very similar. I'm not going to spoil Peacemaker for you, but it's very, very similar. This segment, I am going to talk a little bit more about Moon Knight episode 5. This is the latest episode as of today, as of the recording of this. And a little bit of a spoiler alert. This is probably my least favorite episode of Moon Knight yet, and we'll get into why that is. There are some deeper things that we could talk about here that I think are interesting, but overall, I was a little bit surprised by some of what we saw in this episode. And I believe we only have one more episode to go. So we're right at the end of our Moon Knight journey together. And before I get into some of the specific, maybe more deeper questions or considerations that we could get into, let me first say what I kind of liked and or didn't like about this show. I think that Mark's character development, this episode kind of takes us on a sharp right turn. The only thing that we knew about Mark and Steven's family, never heard of his dad before. This is going to have spoilers, by the way. Tons of spoilers in this, obviously. Never seen Mark's dad before. Never heard of Mark's brother before. The only character that we had heard of related to Mark and this whole episode was his mom. But the only thing we knew about his mom was that he was, basically calling her, and she was not really answering him at all. And I felt like we needed a little bit more context to that. There should have been a little bit more foreshadowing to what we were going to get in this particular episode. Most of the foreshadowing that we've got, we made a big deal about Mark's relationship with Layla and what happened with her dad. We made a big deal about that. But if you'll notice, this particular episode kind of just glosses over that. You kind of just passes by on like there's Layla's dad, and yeah, like I tried to get him out, but it didn't work or whatever. And yet we spend a lot of time on characters that we've really never heard of before, or we're just kind of off to the side characters. The other issue I had with this particular show, this particular episode, I should say, is because I still love Moon Knight, by the way. Don't get me wrong about this, but this is just not my favorite episode. I think that the previous episode should have ended, episode 4 should have ended with them shooting Mark, but not in exploring the afterlife much. I think that this episode, they wanted to make the big reveal, the hippopotamus, which I can't remember her name, Tanawet or something like that. Anyway, they wanted to make that the big reveal, like, oh my gosh, this is crazy, and then boom, like cut to end of episode, wait till next week to see like how that turns out. So one of the things that I think that one of the only critiques of this show, because it's well acted, it's well written, it's very intriguing. I'm not sure that I'm not an editor, I'm not a professional editor. I'm not sure I would have edited this show together in the way that it's been edited, because a lot of times what I feel like when I'm watching this show is that it ends at weird points. It pieces together moments at weird times. I think if we ended the show with Mark getting shot and sinking into the water, we could have started this episode with him exploring this concept of what it's like to be in this afterlife of his own thinking, which of course does get a little convoluted too, because the afterlife of his own thinking is this sort of, for lack of a better term, because I'm not as familiar with Egyptian mythology, they say it in the episode, but it's before he ends up in the duat, or before he ends up in the fields, the plains of grass or whatever. We did get a Marvel reference to the ancestral plane, though. We did get that. The hippopotamus character did reference that. That was kind of interesting. So I think that some of those things, some of the interesting parts of last episode don't get capitalized on here, and I think they could have been, integrated into this episode in a more interesting way. I also thought that the hippopotamus god was a bit of a strange thing to add into this particular episode. You have like this super heavy story about what happened with him and his mom and his brother, And I don't mind that story. I wish we just would have had a little bit more foreshadowing before we get here. But you contrast that heavy, super, super heavy story with this like comical hippopotamus character who is kind of like, I don't know what's going on, and I'm not sure, how to handle this. And that was odd to me. That was an odd choice to go. I don't mind. I will say this. Let me be positive for a second. The show's taking really, really big swings. I love that. Just go for it. Go for the fences. See what happens. That's fantastic. But this episode was a little bit of a miss. There were some things in there that I didn't quite understand too much. But let's dig a little deeper into it. There are several moments in this show that I think produce some pretty interesting questions. One of the things is, as we listen to, as I look at this episode, is I look at like, okay, so we're back in either Mark Spector's mind, in Stephen Grant's mind, or we're somewhere else. And obviously we get the answer to that in this episode. What's happening in what we would have called the real world as of episode 4 is actually happening. And this is some sort of a purgatory before they end up in the Duat, or before they end up, or maybe this is called the Duat, actually. Maybe I'm getting the terms wrong. And so we are in this like holding center that has been created by Mark and Steven in terms of where they're going to go next. They're going to go to heaven, or they're going to go to hell, basically, right? Like the fields of grass are basically heaven, and then hell is basically like the sand dunes that they sink down into, basically like a version of hell, it seems like here. And the whole part of this episode that we have to kind of deal with here is, where will they end up? And the spiritual, philosophical leaning of this film basically suggests that you have to come to terms with, after you've died, you have to come to terms with your behavior on earth, right? Like the literal scale metaphor is like, yeah, do you deserve, like, did you do more bad or did you do more good? And the show seems to suggest that if you regret doing some of the bad, that you can elevate yourself into the place where you would be good. So it's almost like a life reflection. And if in that life reflection, if you reflect that you weren't a very good person, and then you can kind of balance back out that scales, almost as if you're asking for forgiveness for your sins after death. And I think that that's interesting, I guess, but they don't spend a lot of time on it. It seems like it's like a plot device to either move them in one way or another, as opposed to them digging real deep into it, which I don't expect them to dig real deep into it. This is a Marvel show, so I don't expect that to get crazy. I do think that we spent a little bit too much time like with this psychologist perspective of Arthur Harrow, and then trying to make you think that maybe this was fake or not real, or like maybe this is all in his head. That actually ultimately seems like sort of a distraction from the main story of what's actually going on here. So I guess it's interesting, but I kind of wish that the entire show had focused on maybe this problem, meaning the problem of is it in his own head, or like how much is his mental illness affecting him, and what does that look like, and what's the metaphor for that mental illness. I think actually would have been more powerful if the entire show dealt with that. What is compelling about this show is that Oscar Isaac is fantastic, and so he keeps us watching for sure, and makes it more interesting. I'm fast forwarding a little bit. I'm actually have it up on the screen here because I'm fast forwarding a little bit on some of the things just to make sure I don't miss anything. But they do confirm that they did die, and then now they're in the afterlife, and that's why this hippopotamus god is like helping them. And again, the hippopotamus god is like sort of a comedic personality. And it feels really off tone to the rest of the episode. One thing that they've been foreshadowing basically since episode 1 or 2, I can't remember, but one of the things that they've kind of indicated, and it's gotten more serious, and they completely abandoned in episode 5, which I was really shocked by, was that there is a third personality that's so. Even as this started unfolding, one of the things that I thought of was like, well, one of the reasons the scales won't balance, one of the reasons the scales won't balance is because we haven't seen the third personality, and the third personality has to deal with some of this stuff too. And where did the third personality show up in Mark and Steven's lives respectively, and like how did that come about? What we do get though is we do get an explanation of how the Stephen Grant personality came about. Basically it was Mark Spector's way of escapism. He would escape when his mom, who was basically driven to insanity by her son's death, when she would act out on that insanity, he would switch to the Stephen Grant character to avoid her torment. And that was kind of like his safe space was in Stephen Grant's personality. And then, you know, when he goes to his mom's funeral, that breaks for him. And now the two personalities, they're fighting for control all the time. It used to be that Mark chose when he was going to be Stephen Grant. Now Stephen Grant just takes over without Mark being able to prevent that from happening. But the real question I have is this particular episode raises way more questions than it gives me answers, because I'm going, well, where did the third personality come from? There's this idea that you've had a third personality this whole time. Was that created, and when was that created? Was that created because in the horrific events that you had to do, which we see more of in this episode, because we see kind of the backstory of like how they got to be here and like what they did to balance the scales again. And but Mark talks about it as if he did those things. And yet, to me, I felt like it was going to be that the third personality did a lot of those things. Now, we did get a caveat that all the people that Mark had killed as a mercenary working for Khonshu were all really, really, really bad people. I mean, so we get that as kind of like a, you know, something that we can at least, I guess, deal with. But I just felt like that whole thing was a little bit odd. And then we have we go from the mental institution, for lack of a better word, the hospital, the mental hospital. Then we get to the ship that's taking them across the sand dunes. Really cool CG. I mean, that worked really well. There's some really cool CG later on in the episode when there's a fight with, like, for lack of a better word, the sand people, right? The people who Mark killed, who are trying to drag him back into the sands of time. So, I'm going to have to watch this episode again before I really think through, and maybe next week I'll even talk about it some more after I watch it a second time. I did like a few of the things. Like, one of the things that this show does really well is that they include the esoteric metaphysical aspects of what's going on in the physical. So, for example, every room that they enter, maybe not every room, but a lot of the rooms that they enter, the scales are sitting there, right? And you have the feather on one side of the scales and their hearts on the other side of the scales. And it's constantly constantly getting less and less out of balance. I thought that was cool. That's a cool visual effect that I liked. Again, like, I really feel like we should have seen Mark as a kid earlier on. Maybe he's playing with his brother. You'll notice that, like, you could argue that the show Peacemaker, which I really liked, right? You could argue that it's dealing with, from a standpoint of, like, where does the lead character's trauma come from? It's very similar. I'm not going to spoil Peacemaker for you, but it's very, very similar. And I think Peacemaker did a much better job of saying, like, look, this is the character's Peacemaker. Can't remember his name. Christopher, maybe? His earlier life, right? And here's what it kind of looked like. And it's building towards something. So, like, there's two timelines. There's the current timeline, and then there's the past timeline. And both those things are impacting where the story is going overall. This is more like, yeah, like, this is the current timeline. Everything is really weird and bizarre, and there's these weird Egyptian gods, like, manipulating people and possessing them and stuff. And then, boom, we hit episode 5, which is, I think, the penultimate episode. There's only one more episode left in this series, I believe. So hopefully we're going to get a season 2, because I would like to see more from this world. And then all of a sudden it's like, boom, here's the family story. And that seemed like a lot all at once. And that was a bit much for me personally. I didn't love that particular aspect of it. I did think that there was some interesting back and forth between Arthur Harrow as the doctor and Stephen and Mark, and how they were interacting with one another. He says some things about, like, well, is this sense or is this nonsense? And there's a lot of things that in there that were kind of interesting. But again, as soon as we learned that this was just like a construct of their mind, then a lot of that stuff kind of doesn't become as interesting, especially philosophically interesting, because it doesn't matter. It's just like a figment of his own mind. Now, the way this episode ends, I thought was really crazy because we've already lost Khonshu. He's off the table. He's not influencing anybody, and we haven't actually seen him since. We saw a flashback scene where we actually didn't see Khonshu. Really, we saw the giant representation of him as a statue, but we didn't really get to interact with him much. He was talking to Mark. But now we lose Steven in the end of this episode. Steven's lost, right? Like, we don't have the character of Steven anymore, and Mark ends up in the fields of grass. I think that, so I did not expect this. I did not expect any of this at all. I think I will be a little bit disappointed if the only way this is going to be resolved is if they have to go back in time, or if one of the Egyptian gods has to then admit that they were wrong about Arthur Harrow, and the only way they're going to conquer Arthur Harrow is to pull Mark out of the fields of grass, pull Steven out of the sands of time, for lack of a better description, and then bring them back and establish Khonshu again. I feel like that's what's going to happen, but I'd like it to be more interesting than that. I'd like it to be building to something more interesting than that. So, not my favorite episode of Moon Knight. I still enjoy the show. Don't get me wrong. Episode 4 was fantastic. I really liked Layla's character. I liked Layla's character. You could have an entire show about Layla as Indiana Jane, and I would love that show. That'd be an amazing show. I would want to watch that show. The show has been great until this episode, I think, which was fine. This is a fine episode. It's not a bad episode, but we've seen such good stuff from Moon Knight that this one surprised me a little bit. Wasn't my favorite. I am curious to see what you thought of Moon Knight episode 5. Is this kind of one of your favorite episodes, or is this like it is for me, like one of the episodes that's near the bottom? And what can we expect from episode 6? I will tell you that next week, so long as we can make the schedules work out, Michael Young will be joining me. Can't wait to talk to Michael, one of my favorite people to podcast with. He will be joining me next Thursday, hopefully, to talk about episode 6 of Moon Knight and the entire series in general. I haven't even talked to him. I don't even know what he's really thought about it, so I am curious to see what that looks like. Please leave me a comment down below and let me know what you thought of it. And if there were any philosophical questions that you'd like for me to address, or any storytelling questions that you had that may have come up or bubbled to the surface that you would like to ask me, ask them down in the comments below.